Hello, beautiful souls. Welcome back to Stories That Change Hearts. Before we begin, let me tell you something. What you're about to hear isn't just a love story. It's about a woman who had everything figured out, until one collision in an airport shattered every assumption she'd ever made about success, love, and the kind of man worth fighting for. This is the story of how Charlotte Hayes went from calling someone an arrogant, entitled disaster, to realizing he was the love of her life. And trust me, the journey will leave you breathless. I was 32 years old when I learned that sometimes the person you despise at first sight can become the person you can't imagine living without. It started with a collision in JFK Airport, escalated to professional humiliation, and ended with the kind of love that makes you believe in second chances. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a man wearing faded jeans and carrying a guitar case became the most important person in my carefully constructed Manhattan empire. Charlotte Hayes adjusted her Hermes briefcase for what felt like the 100th time, her emerald eyes scanning the chaotic sprawl of JFK International Airport with practiced precision. At 32, she'd built Hayes Consulting Group from a struggling startup into a $68 million empire. She delivered keynote addresses at Fortune 500 summits, negotiated contracts that made grown men sweat, and revolutionized digital marketing strategies used by corporations across 3 continents. But standing here in Terminal 4 on a Tuesday morning, about to board her first flight to Los Angeles for a massive West Coast expansion, she felt uncharacteristically nervous. Her charcoal Armani Power suit probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her Louboutin heels clicked with authority against the polished airport floor. Charlotte knew she looked successful, intimidating even. That was intentional. In the cutthroat world of New York business consulting, looking weak was a death sentence. Flight 624 to Los Angeles, now boarding at Gate C-17, echoed through the terminal speakers. Gate C-17. Charlotte's mind calculated instantly, 7 minutes if she walked briskly, accounting for the security checkpoint and the inevitable incompetence of holiday travelers clogging the corridors. She could make it. She started down the terminal, her heels creating a sharp staccato rhythm as she dodged families with strollers and business travelers moving at speeds that would embarrass snails. Her phone buzzed, her assistant confirming the LA meetings were set, the hotel reservation was confirmed, everything perfectly orchestrated as always. Charlotte didn't see him until it was too late. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. She felt her teeth rattle as she collided with something solid, someone solid. Her briefcase flew open, spilling files, her tablet, and mortifyingly, a package of emergency tampons that skittered across the floor to land at the feet of a man in faded jeans and a vintage band t-shirt. "Whoa! I'm so sorry," a voice said, warm, concerned, with a California accent that grated against Charlotte's New York sensibilities. Charlotte looked up, ready to deliver a withering assessment of people who didn't watch where they were going, and found herself staring at one of the most unexpectedly handsome men she'd ever seen. He had sandy blonde hair that looked artfully messy in that effortless way California guys somehow managed, warm hazel eyes currently filled with genuine concern, and he wore a leather jacket that had clearly seen better days. A guitar case was slung across his back, and he looked like he'd just stepped off a beach somewhere, casual, relaxed, completely out of place in the corporate chaos of JFK. And he was looking at her with the most infuriatingly laid-back expression Charlotte had ever encountered. "You could at least watch where you're going," Charlotte snapped, her carefully cultivated professional composure cracking under the stress of running late and now this disaster. The man blinked, clearly surprised by her sharp tone. "I was watching. You were sprinting through the terminal like you were being chased by something." "I'm about to miss my flight," Charlotte said coldly, kneeling to gather her scattered belongings. "Something that might be difficult for you West Coast people to understand, the concept of actually being on time." The man's eyebrows shot up. "West Coast people?" "Yes. You know, perpetually late, chronically relaxed, treating the entire world like one big beach day where punctuality is just a suggestion." Charlotte shoved files back into her briefcase with more force than necessary. Instead of getting defensive, the man actually smiled, a slow, amused smile that made Charlotte's irritation spike even higher. He bent down and picked up her tampons, holding them out with the kind of casual ease that suggested he'd been raised with sisters and wasn't remotely embarrassed. "Here's your emergency supplies," he said, his hazel eyes twinkling with barely suppressed laughter. "And for the record, some of us West Coast people actually invented the technology you're probably using to schedule all those important meetings you're running late for." Charlotte snatched the package from his hand, her cheeks burning. "Excuse me? Just saying, maybe don't make assumptions about people based on geography." He stood up, extending a hand to help her. "I'm actually flying to New York for a business deal. First time leaving California for work. So we're basically in opposite situations right now." Charlotte ignored his offered hand and stood on her own, years of New York independence making accepting help feel like weakness. Final boarding call for Flight 624 to Los Angeles, Gate C-17. Gate closing in 3 minutes. Charlotte's heart dropped. "No, no, no. Flight 624? The man said, surprise evident in his voice. "What a coincidence. That's my flight too." Charlotte looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the worn jeans, the vintage Fleetwood Mac t-shirt, the guitar case, the complete lack of professional attire. "You're flying to LA on a business flight dressed like that?" His smile turned dangerously slow. "Dressed like what exactly?" "Like someone who doesn't feel the need to prove their worth through expensive designer labels." Passengers for Flight 624, final boarding call. Gate closing in 90 seconds. "We should run," the man said, grabbing his own duffel bag. "Unless you'd prefer to continue this fascinating character assassination and miss the flight entirely?" Charlotte wanted to say something cutting, something that would put this overly relaxed, infuriatingly handsome California disaster in his place. Instead, she grabbed her briefcase and ran. They made it to the gate with literally 30 seconds to spare, both breathing hard. The gate agent gave them a disapproving look but scanned their boarding passes. "Seat 14B, Charlotte heard the man say behind her. Her heart sank as she looked at her own ticket. 14, window seat. Right next to the walking embodiment of everything she found frustrating about West Coast culture. This was going to be the longest flight of her life. 45 minutes later, settled into seat 14A with the California disaster right beside her in 14B, Charlotte tried to focus on her laptop. Tried being the operative word. "So," the man said, his voice carrying that same casual warmth that somehow managed to be both irritating and disarming, "I feel like we got off on the wrong foot back there." Charlotte didn't look up from her screen. "We're sitting in adjacent airplane seats for the next 6 hours. We don't need to get off on any foot. We can simply coexist in silence." 6 hours is a long time to sit in angry silence, he pointed out. "I'm Chen, by the way. Tech entrepreneur from San Francisco. Currently heading to New York to pitch a new software platform to some East Coast investors." Despite herself, Charlotte's interest was piqued. She glanced at him. "What kind of software?" Mason's face lit up, genuine enthusiasm replacing the casual amusement. "AI-driven marketing analytics. It uses machine learning to predict consumer behavior patterns across multiple platforms simultaneously. We're talking about revolutionizing how companies understand their customers." Charlotte felt her professional instincts kick in. That actually sounded impressive and potentially relevant to her own business. Hayes Consulting specializes in digital marketing strategy, she heard herself say. "We're always looking for innovative analytics tools." Mason's eyes widened with recognition. "Hayes Consulting? You're Charlotte Hayes?" Charlotte felt a small surge of satisfaction. "You've heard of my company?" "Heard of it? Your work with the Reynolds Corporation digital transformation is literally used as a case study at Stanford Business School." Mason was looking at her with something approaching awe now. "You increased their online engagement by 300% in 8 months. That's legendary." Charlotte felt her hostility softening slightly. "You studied my work?" "Studied it, analyzed it, tried to reverse engineer your strategy." Mason grinned. "You're kind of a celebrity in the marketing tech world. Though I have to say, the professional journals never mention that you also specialize in airport collision-based confrontations." Despite herself, Charlotte felt the corner of her mouth twitch. I don't usually physically assault people in terminals. You caught me on a stressful morning. Caught you? Mason raised an eyebrow. I'm pretty sure you caught me. With your face. Against my chest. While moving at approximately 15 miles per hour. Charlotte actually laughed. A real laugh that surprised her. Hey, fine. Maybe I was moving slightly faster than appropriate for indoor spaces. Slightly faster, Mason repeated, his smile widening. That's one way to describe what looked like an Olympic sprinting event. I don't like being late, Charlotte said. Punctuality is. Let me guess, Mason interrupted gently. Punctuality is a sign of respect for other people's time. It demonstrates professionalism and reliability. Charlotte blinked. Yes, actually. How did you? Because that's exactly what my grandmother used to say. She was Chinese American, first generation, built a restaurant empire in San Francisco from nothing. Taught me that success required discipline and respect. Mason's expression grew softer. She passed away last year. Cancer. I'm sorry, Charlotte said and meant it. Thank you. Mason was quiet for a moment. She would have liked you, I think. She always said I needed someone who would challenge me instead of just agreeing with everything I said. Is that what usually happens? People just agree with you? Mason shrugged. When you have money and success, people tend to tell you what they think you want to hear instead of what you need to know. It's lonely, actually. Charlotte understood that more than she wanted to admit. Her own success had created a wall between her and genuine human connection. People either wanted something from her, were intimidated by her, or dismissed her as a cold corporate machine. So, she said, changing the subject before it got too personal, tell me about this AI platform. How does it differ from existing analytics tools? Mason's face lit up again, and for the next 2 hours, they discussed technology, marketing strategies, business philosophy, and the challenges of building companies from scratch. Charlotte found herself genuinely engaged, not just professionally interested, but intellectually stimulated in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Mason was brilliant. Not just smart, but creative and innovative. He thought about problems from angles she'd never considered. And unlike most of the tech entrepreneurs she'd met, he actually understood the human element of business. How people thought, what motivated them, why traditional corporate structures often failed. You're not what I expected, Charlotte admitted as the plane began its descent into LAX. What did you expect? Mason asked, though his smile suggested he already knew. Someone less substantive. When I saw the guitar and the casual clothes, I assumed that I was some surf bum who got lucky with a tech idea? Mason finished. Yeah, I get that a lot. Especially from East Coast people. Charlotte felt her cheeks warm. I was prejudiced. I apologize. Apology accepted, Mason said. And for what it's worth, you're not what I expected either. What did you expect? Someone colder. All the articles about you make you sound like this ruthless corporate machine. But you're actually passionate about this stuff. You care about doing good work, not just making money. Charlotte felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the plane's cabin temperature. So, Mason said as the plane touched down, I know this is probably against all your professional instincts, but would you maybe want to have dinner sometime while I'm in New York? Talk more about analytics platforms and marketing strategies? Maybe argue about whether East Coast or West Coast pizza is superior. Charlotte knew she should say no. Mason represented everything she'd spent years avoiding: unpredictability, emotional risk, the kind of casual approach to life that made her uncomfortable. But looking into those warm hazel eyes, remembering the past 2 hours of genuine conversation and unexpected connection, she heard herself say, I'm actually based in New York. And yes, I'd like that. Mason's smile was radiant. Yeah. Yes. But I have to warn you, New York pizza is objectively superior to anything California has to offer. Oh, this friendship is going to be challenging, Mason said with a laugh. I accept the challenge. They exchanged phone numbers as the plane taxied to the gate. Charlotte felt lighter than she had in months, excited in a way that had nothing to do with business deals or corporate success. She had no idea that Chen was about to become the most important person in her life. That the casual dinner invitation would lead to late-night phone conversations, weekend trips between coasts, and eventually the kind of love that changes everything. All because of one collision in JFK Airport and a 6-hour flight where two people from different worlds discovered they might actually understand each other perfectly. 2 weeks later, Manhattan. Charlotte sat in her corner office on the 42nd floor of her building in Midtown Manhattan, staring at her phone like it might suddenly provide answers to questions she wasn't ready to ask. Mason had been in New York for 9 days now. 9 days of dinners that turned into 3-hour conversations. 9 days of discovering that underneath his casual exterior was someone who understood her in ways nobody else ever had. They'd had dinner the night he arrived. A small Italian place in the West Village where they'd argued about pizza. She was right, obviously, debated the merits of East Coast versus West Coast business culture, and laughed until Charlotte's cheeks hurt. Then he'd invited her to hear him play guitar at a tiny music venue in Brooklyn. Charlotte, who never did spontaneous things, who never deviated from her carefully planned schedule, had said yes. Watching Mason on that small stage, playing acoustic versions of songs she'd grown up with, she'd felt something crack open in her chest. He was talented, genuinely talented. And the way he looked at her between songs, like she was the only person in the room, made her feel seen in a way she'd forgotten was possible. "You're staring at your phone like it offended you," her assistant Vivian said, appearing in the doorway with Charlotte's afternoon coffee. "Let me guess, mysterious California guy?" Charlotte had made the mistake of mentioning Mason once. Now Vivian was convinced this was some grand romance. "He's just a friend," Charlotte said automatically. "A friend you've seen every single day for over a week? A friend who makes you actually smile instead of that terrifying professional expression you usually wear?" Vivian set the coffee down with a knowing look. "Sure, boss. Just a friend." Charlotte's phone buzzed. A text from Mason. "Pitch meeting with Sterling Investments went amazing. They're interested in the platform. Want to celebrate tonight? I found this rooftop place with incredible views. 7 p.m.? Charlotte looked at her calendar. She had a networking event tonight, the kind of obligatory corporate gathering she normally forced herself to attend for business development purposes. She texted back, "I have a work thing tonight. Rain check?" Mason's response came immediately, "Work thing or hiding from feelings thing? Because I'm pretty sure we passed just colleagues discussing business about 3 dinners ago." Charlotte stared at the message, her heart hammering. He was right. They both knew it. Somewhere between discussing marketing analytics and arguing about whether New York or California had better beaches, they'd crossed a line from professional acquaintances to something else entirely. Her phone rang. Mason's name on the screen. "Are you calling to pressure me about tonight?" Charlotte answered, trying to sound stern. "I'm calling because texting about feelings is terrible," Mason said, his voice warm and slightly nervous. "Charlotte, I like you. Like, really like you. And I'm pretty sure you like me too, despite your best efforts to categorize me as a business contact, or whatever corporate terminology you're using to avoid dealing with emotions." Charlotte felt her carefully constructed walls trembling. "Mason, I know you're scared. I know you've built this incredibly successful life that doesn't have room for unpredictability. I know I'm from a different world than you are. But Charlotte, these past 2 weeks have been the best 2 weeks I've had in years. And I think we could be amazing together if you just let yourself take a chance." Charlotte closed her eyes, feeling tears threatening, actual tears, which she never allowed at work. "I don't know how to do this. Casual, unpredictable, letting someone in. It's not. I'm not built for that." "You're not built for it, or you've just convinced yourself you're not?" Mason asked gently. "Because the woman I've gotten to know, the one who laughed so hard at my terrible jokes that she snorted wine, she seems pretty capable of letting loose when she wants to." Charlotte remembered that night. Dinner at a tiny Thai place where Mason had told increasingly ridiculous stories about his early startup days until Charlotte had actually snorted Pinot Noir. She'd been mortified. He'd been delighted. "Skip the work thing," Mason said softly. "Come celebrate with me. Let yourself be happy, Charlotte. Just for one night. No pressure, no expectations." Just two people who really enjoy spending time together. Charlotte looked at her calendar, the networking event she'd been dreading all week. Then she looked at the last 2 weeks of her life, the most genuinely happy she'd been since building her company. Okay, she heard herself say. Oh yes. 7 o'clock. Text me the address. Mason's joy was audible through the phone. Yeah. Really? Really? But Mason? Yes. If this rooftop place doesn't actually have incredible views, I'm never trusting your judgment again. Mason laughed, that warm, genuine laugh that made Charlotte's chest feel too small to contain her emotions. I promise the views will be worth it. Though honestly, I'm mostly planning to spend the evening looking at you. Charlotte felt her cheeks flush. That was extremely cheesy. But did it work? Despite herself, Charlotte smiled. Yes. It worked. 6 months later, Charlotte stood in her apartment, wearing the 4th dress she tried on in the past hour, feeling like a nervous teenager instead of a successful business executive. Mason was coming over for dinner. The first time he'd be in her personal space, the ultra-modern, meticulously organized Manhattan apartment that reflected everything about her controlled, structured life. They'd been dating for almost 6 months now. 6 months of weekend trips between New York and San Francisco. 6 months of late-night video calls when they couldn't be together. 6 months of discovering that sometimes the person who seems completely wrong for you turns out to be absolutely perfect. Mason made her laugh. Made her feel light in a way she'd forgotten was possible. Challenged her assumptions while respecting her intelligence. Showed her that success and joy weren't mutually exclusive, that she could be both the driven CEO and the woman who danced in her kitchen at midnight. Her doorbell rang at exactly 7 p.m. Charlotte opened the door to find Mason standing there with a bouquet of wildflowers, not roses, because he knew she found traditional romantic gestures cliché, wearing dark jeans and a button-down shirt that somehow managed to be both casual and put together. "Hi," he said, his hazel eyes warm. "You look absolutely beautiful." Charlotte was wearing a simple emerald dress, her favorite color, which Mason had discovered she loved during one of their many late-night conversations. "You're on time," she said, accepting the flowers. "I'm impressed." "My grandmother's training," Mason said with a grin. "Also, I've been standing outside your building for 15 minutes because I was early and didn't want to seem too eager." Charlotte laughed, pulling him inside. "That's both sweet and ridiculous." Mason looked around her apartment, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, the modern furniture, the perfectly organized bookshelves. "This is incredibly you," he said finally. "Beautiful, sophisticated, and absolutely terrifying in its perfection." "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation." Mason set down the guitar case he'd been carrying. "Also, I brought this. Thought maybe after dinner I could play you something I've been working on." Charlotte felt her heart skip. Mason had been writing a song. He'd mentioned it in passing weeks ago but had been secretive about the details. They cooked dinner together, or rather, Charlotte attempted to cook while Mason provided entertaining commentary and occasionally saved dishes from total disaster. She'd planned an elaborate meal to impress him, but halfway through they'd abandoned the complicated recipes in favor of making simple pasta and laughing about her lack of culinary skills. "I can negotiate million-dollar contracts, but I can't properly sauté vegetables," Charlotte said, watching Mason rescue the burnt peppers. "This is humiliating." "This is humanizing," Mason corrected, stirring the pan with practiced ease. "You're allowed to have weaknesses, Charlotte. It doesn't make you less successful. It makes you real." They ate dinner on her balcony, overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline. Mason told her about his pitch meeting that had gone well, about his plans to open a New York office for his company. Charlotte talked about the new consulting contract she'd just landed, about her anxiety over expanding her team. "I've been thinking," Mason said as they finished dessert, "about us. About how we're doing this long-distance thing." Charlotte's stomach tightened. "Okay. I want to be in New York more. A lot more." Mason reached across the table and took her hand. "My company can operate from anywhere. And Charlotte, I want to be where you are." "Mason, you can't uproot your entire life." "Why not? You've been traveling to San Francisco twice a month." We've been making this work, but it's hard. And I don't want hard anymore. I want us to be in the same city, building something real together." Charlotte felt tears threatening, happy tears this time. "You'd move here? To New York?" "I'd move anywhere for you," Mason said simply. "But yes, New York makes sense. Your company is here. Your life is here. And honestly, I think I'm becoming a New Yorker. I actually yelled at a slow walker yesterday." Charlotte laughed through her tears. "That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me." "Yeah." Mason stood up and pulled her into his arms. "Well, get ready, because I've been working on something even more romantic." He retrieved his guitar and settled onto her couch, patting the space beside him. Charlotte sat down, her heart racing. Mason started playing, a soft, beautiful melody that filled her perfect apartment with warmth. And then he began to sing. The song was about two people from different worlds finding each other in an airport. About coffee shop conversations and cross-country flights. About a woman who taught him that strength and vulnerability could coexist. About falling in love with someone who challenged every assumption he'd ever had about what love should look like. By the time he finished, Charlotte was crying openly, something she never did, something she'd trained herself out of years ago. "I love you," Mason said, setting down the guitar and cupping her face in his hands. "I love your brilliant mind and your terrible cooking skills. I love how you pretend to be this cold corporate machine, but you're actually the most passionate person I've ever met. I love that you still don't think California pizza is legitimate even though you're completely wrong." Charlotte laughed through her tears. "I love you too. Even though you wear concert t-shirts to business meetings and think punctuality is a suggestion." "I'm always on time now," Mason protested. "You reformed me." "I didn't reform you. I just fell in love with exactly who you are." Mason kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, both smiling through happy tears, Charlotte felt something she hadn't felt in years. Complete. Not because Mason completed her, she was already whole on her own, but because he made her believe that she could be both the powerful CEO and the woman who cried at love songs. That success and softness weren't mutually exclusive. "So," Mason said, pulling her closer, "what do you think? New York office? Me being here full-time? Us actually building a life together instead of just weekends and video calls?" Charlotte looked around her perfectly organized apartment, at the controlled, structured life she'd built so carefully. Then she looked at Mason, who represented everything unpredictable and spontaneous and wonderful that she'd been too scared to want. "Yes," she said. "Yes to all of it. Yes to you being here. Yes to building something real. Yes to everything." Mason's smile was radiant. "Even yes to California pizza occasionally?" "Don't push your luck, Chen." "Worth a shot," he said, kissing her again. 18 months later, Charlotte stood in the stunning Brooklyn venue Mason had discovered, wearing an elegant champagne-colored gown that was somehow both sophisticated and romantic, much like the relationship they'd built together. Small fairy lights illuminated the converted warehouse space. About 100 people, their closest friends and family, filled the room with laughter and love. Mason's grandmother's recipes had been used by the caterers, honoring the woman who'd taught him about success and respect. Charlotte's business partners sat alongside Mason's creative friends, two worlds that had initially seemed incompatible but had blended beautifully. "You ready?" Vivian asked, appearing beside Charlotte with champagne and a knowing smile. "Your West Coast disaster is waiting for you out there." Charlotte laughed. That nickname had stuck. Mason still occasionally introduced himself as Charlotte's West Coast disaster at parties, which never failed to make her roll her eyes and smile simultaneously. "I'm ready," Charlotte said, meaning it completely. The ceremony was short and personal. They'd written their own vows, naturally, because neither of them did anything traditionally. "Charlotte Hayes," Mason said, his voice thick with emotion as he stood across from her, "you terrified me when we first met. You were everything I thought I didn't want, structured, intense, absolutely unwilling to compromise on your pizza opinions." Laughter rippled through the crowd. "But somewhere between that airport collision and right now, you became everything I didn't know I needed. You taught me that discipline and spontaneity can coexist. That success doesn't mean sacrificing joy. That love isn't about finding someone exactly like you. It's about finding someone who challenges you to be better while loving exactly who you already are. Charlotte felt tears streaming down her face. She'd given up trying to hide emotions years ago, somewhere around the 3rd month of dating Mason. I promise to always watch where I'm going in airports, Mason continued, grinning. To respect your need for schedule and structure while occasionally convincing you to do something spontaneous. To never, ever tell you that California pizza is superior, even though we both know it is. It's not. Charlotte called out, and everyone laughed. I promise to love you through every business deal and every setback. To celebrate your victories and support you through challenges. To be your partner in every sense of the word. In business, in life, in ridiculous debates about food that will probably last forever. Mason's voice grew softer. You're my home, Charlotte. Wherever you are is where I want to be. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. Charlotte took a shaky breath, trying to compose herself enough to deliver her own vows. Chen, she began, when we collided in that airport, I thought you were everything I didn't have time for. Casual, unpredictable, completely unconcerned with the things I'd been taught mattered. Appearances, punctuality, maintaining professional distance. She smiled through her tears. You were also the first person in years who saw past the CEO to the actual person underneath. Who made me laugh until I couldn't breathe. Who taught me that sometimes the best things in life are the ones you don't plan. Charlotte reached out and took both his hands. You didn't change me, Mason. You just loved me enough that I felt safe being myself, the version of me that dances in kitchens and cries at romantic songs and occasionally takes spontaneous trips without a detailed itinerary. Occasionally is generous, Mason murmured, and she laughed. I promise to love your creative chaos while maintaining our shared calendar, because someone has to remember our anniversary, Charlotte said. To support your dreams while building my own. To never stop arguing with you about pizza because honestly, those debates are some of my favorite memories. Her voice grew serious. I promise to be your partner in every adventure. To trust you when you suggest something spontaneous. To remember that the best decision I ever made was saying yes to dinner with a West Coast disaster who turned out to be the love of my life. Mason, you're my home too. You're the person who makes me want to be brave enough to risk my heart. I love you completely, your terrible time management, your ridiculous confidence in California's culinary superiority, and absolutely everything in between. They were both crying now, smiling through happy tears while their friends and family watched with their own tears and laughter. When the officiant pronounced them married, Mason pulled Charlotte into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, dipping her dramatically while everyone cheered. Still think I'm a disaster? Mason whispered against her lips. Absolutely, Charlotte whispered back. My favorite disaster. At the reception, they danced to a song Mason had written specifically for this moment, about two people who collided in an airport and found forever. Charlotte rested her head against his shoulder, feeling his heartbeat steady against her cheek, and thought about how far they'd come. She'd built a successful company. Mason had opened his New York office, and their businesses were actually collaborating on projects now, the perfect blend of her strategic thinking and his creative innovation. But more than professional success, they'd built a life together. A messy, imperfect, absolutely beautiful life that included spontaneous weekend trips and carefully planned business meetings, California visits and New York adventures, arguments about food and conversations that lasted until sunrise. What are you thinking about? Mason asked, swaying with her to the music. I'm thinking about how I almost said no to dinner that first time. How scared I was of letting someone unpredictable into my carefully controlled life. And now, Charlotte looked up at him, at the man who'd crashed into her life and refused to leave even when she tried to push him away. Now I'm grateful every single day that I was brave enough to say yes. Me too, Mason said, kissing her forehead. Though I'm still working on convincing you about the pizza thing. Never going to happen, Chen. I have a lifetime to change your mind, Chen. Charlotte smiled, loving the sound of their hyphenated name. A lifetime of debates. That sounds perfect. As they danced surrounded by everyone they loved, Charlotte realized that sometimes the best things in life happen when you're willing to deviate from the plan. When you're brave enough to risk your heart on someone who seems completely wrong but turns out to be absolutely perfect. She'd learned that love wasn't about finding someone who fit perfectly into your existing life. It was about building a new life together, one that made space for both structure and spontaneity, professional success and personal joy, New York efficiency and California warmth. Most importantly, she'd learned that sometimes the person you collide with in an airport, the one you initially dismiss as completely incompatible, turns out to be the person you can't imagine living without. And that was the greatest success Charlotte Hayes had ever achieved. Thank you for listening to this story, beautiful souls. If it touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear that love often arrives exactly when we're not looking for it, and sometimes looks nothing like what we expected. Remember, the best adventures begin with an unexpected collision and a willingness to take a chance on something beautifully unpredictable. Until next time, keep your hearts open to possibility.